So the first thing we're going to do is, if we've never downloaded PIXERA before, let's go get it from our homepage. That's PIXERA.1. And from there, I can navigate to the downloads page. And from here, we can get the latest version of PIXERA right here. And so if we click on that, that'll start our download. I have already downloaded it, so that's going to be right here in our downloads folder. And we can go ahead and run this installer, and that will install PIXERA for us. Now, once we've installed PIXERA, that will install a couple of different softwares for us, which brings us to a very interesting point about PIXERA, and that is that PIXERA is actually made up of a couple of different softwares. So we have PIXERA Hub, which is that circle with a bunch of little circles coming off of it, like a nexus point. Then we have PIXERA, which is represented by the triangles, and Presence, represented by the segmented circle. And we have the RX, or the render engine, and that is a piece of software that we don't actually control very much in terms of using a GUI, but is controlled and is very important through PIXERA and Presence. So Hub is a utility software, and if we go ahead and look back at our desktop here, we can see that there's a PIXERA Hub icon. And if I double click on that, that's going to bring up PIXERA Hub. And this is a utility application, has a lot of really great features. It is not necessary for running PIXERA, but again, it does get installed when you install PIXERA, so it's really nice to have. And we can install a bunch of different versions from here. We can look at the installers available online, and we can see what version we have. And we can see that PIXERA is currently running on my machine. If you wanted, you could click on this to start it, and that would open up PIXERA. Okay, so we've got PIXERA opened up here. And the first thing to talk about with PIXERA is to look at these 4 tabs over here. So PIXERA's main workflow centers around these 4 tabs. We start in the Screens tab, and moving our way from left to right, kind of like reading a book, we go Screens, Mapping, Compositing, and Control. And each of those tabs has a different part of your project setup associated with it. So in the Screens tab, we're going to be handling our physical setup. What does our physical world look like? In the Mapping tab, we're going to be looking at our digital to physical, and how do those digital outputs map to the physical world we just created in the Screens tab. These 2 tabs are probably about 20 to 25% of your programming time. And once you finish with them, with a couple of exceptions, you actually don't come back to the Screens or Mapping tab. So when we move to the Compositing tab, this is probably 75% of your programming time, unless you're doing a bunch of stuff in Control, which we'll talk about later on. So in the Compositing tab, this is where we're doing a bunch of our actual show programming. We're going to do cues. We're going to point at screens and tell different pieces of content where to go on those screens. All that programming is done here. And then the Control tab, like I said, is where we're going to handle our show control. This can be either a lot of your programming or not a lot of your programming, just depends on your show or your project. There's one other important workspace to talk about here, and that is the Settings tab, or the Settings. I sometimes refer to it as a hidden 5th tab, though it is neither hidden nor exactly a tab. And this is where we get a bunch of our properties and parameters. Specifically and importantly, we can look at making a new project, or saving projects that we're working on, or bundling projects together. All right, so now that we have examined each tab individually, let's look at our workspace itself and talk about each of these panels we have in front of us. So the left panel here, we refer to as the library. The middle panel is what we call our workspace. And the right panel is known as the inspector. Jumping back to the library is going to have all of our stuff in it that we associate with that tab. So the Screens tab, as an example, would have our physical stuff in it that we're going to bring into our project that would be associated with the real world objects that we are using. So things like displays or LED panels to make LED walls or projection surfaces in our screens. This middle section here is our workspace. Our workspace is where we're going to bring our objects into our workspace in order to interact with them. All of these are considered in our project. I often think about using PIXERA like driving a car and going on a road trip. And so this left panel over here, the library, is like the stuff that we're going to go get for our road trip. And the middle panel here is our workspace or our car that we have to put all of our stuff into. As an example, I can go find a display, just double clicking or clicking on these triangles to twirl those sections down. And then I can click and drag on this generic 40-inch FHD and drag it into the workspace, just like taking a box and putting it in the car, or taking a suitcase and putting it in our car. On the right panel, we have our inspector. This is a context-dependent panel, and what that means is that when I click on something, this information is going to populate in the inspector based on what I've clicked on. So I've clicked on this display here, and I can see more information about that display over here. A common refrain you're going to hear when you're working with PIXERA is that if you click on something, you can find more information about it in the inspector, as the inspector will contain all of the properties associated with that object that you've selected. Over in our library panel, we also have this project tab. This project tab is going to show us what's actually in our workspace. So all of the things that we've brought in from the library that are now in the workspace. It's like a packing list for your road trip. So we have all the things that we could possibly bring. And in the project tab, this is all the things that we've actually packed into the workspace. Another thing we can do when working with our panels here is we can click in the gutters in between the panels. So this gutter right here between the library and the workspace, or this one between the inspector and the workspace. And we can click and drag in order to resize these to our heart's content. We can also click in the gutter and right click. And here we get the option to split our workspace here. So I could split this vertically and that'll add another panel. And it says right click mouse to display matching components that can be placed here. So I could right click and I can add a library. And from here, I could say add this project over to this panel. And so now we actually have our library and our project tree in separate panels so that we can work with those however we want. I could also right click on this and press detach in order to get a floating window. And when I hit the X button, that'll just go back to our workspace. If these things get too messy and I've got a bunch of panels that I've split out and I've added a library and I've added all these things and it starts to get too messy, I can always right click in a gutter and hit reset layout. And that'll reset back to the default layout. I can also right click in the gutter and I can hover over this layout where I get this save current. So I could customize my layout and then I could right click and say save current as new layout, hit OK. And now if I resize this and make it even wackier, I can always right click, go to layout, and then click on this new layout to recall that layout from before. All right, so taking a closer look at our workspace here, we can see we have up in the top right corner a bunch of tools and icons. This is the Workspace Toolbar. It has some useful things that will help us with navigating or viewing things in the workspace. One of those things that I'm going to turn on right away is this icon here. If I hover over it, I get a tooltip. It says Show Grid. If I press G or click on that, it will activate a floor plane, which helps orient us in our workspace. This doesn't have any effect on the output or anything going on with programming. It's just a reference in order to help you, the programmer, orient yourself in 3D space. Let's go over how to manipulate objects in our workspace. We can click on our object and we get, again, more information in the inspector about this display. And I can look over and see that I have some position, size, and rotation parameters here. I can click on this object and hold and move that object around, and we can see that that position value is changing as we do that. I could also click into these boxes in the inspector, and I can type in values here. So for example, I could type 0 and hit tab and then 0 again, and that will snap my object or my screen to the origin at 0, 0. So I could type in 1, tab 1, and that will move me to 1, 1. You'll notice that position is in meters. We do not at this moment have a way to change into imperial. Sorry to my American friends and colleagues out there. We are using meters. I can also click in this box and drag up and down in order to change those values. I could click into the Y parameter here. If I hold the shift button while I click, we can see that I get a fine control. And that shift will actually carry through to lots of other pieces of the software as a fine control. So holding shift is always a good idea if you need a little better control over that. We can also do math in these boxes. So I can click in to here and I can say +1, which will change this value in this case to 1.6. Or I could subtract 1.6, which will put me back at 0. One last really cool feature is I can click into this box one time and that will highlight this number. And then I can use programming syntax to do arithmetic to the number that is currently highlighted. The way that I do that is I would need to press 2 of whatever function that I'd like to perform on that value. So in this case, I would do ++2 to add 2 to the value that was previously highlighted, which was 0. And 0 + 2 is 2. I can do it again here and say ++4, which will give me a value of 4. If I subtract this by 8, that should move me to -4, which is off the screen somewhere down here. Let's go ahead and get it back to 0 by adding 4. And I could subtract 4 here, which will get me to -2. And then I could add 2 back, which will get me to 0. Now to go over navigating the workspace itself. In order to do that, we need a mouse that has a scroll wheel or a middle mouse button, as that's pretty pivotal to how we navigate in this space. So the way we do that is I can click in on the scroll wheel and I can move my mouse around, and that's my pan function. If I hold the Alt key and press in on the middle mouse, that is my orbit. And then if I scroll on the middle mouse, that is my zoom. One interesting thing to note about a zoom is that if I zoom in while hovering over an object, it zooms in on the object. If I am not hovering on the object, it'll center on my mouse point. So it'll hover in and out of the void. I can hold shift here as well to get a fine control on my zoom. And I can use this little box over here to orbit if I don't want to use the Alt key. And you can actually click on the faces of this box in order to move those things around. And that will snap our view to one of those viewpoints. If I ever get lost and I don't know where I am and I end up with this kind of screen, we'll jump back to that Workspace toolbar up here, and I can hover over this one on the far right. This is our reset camera, hotkey R, which will reset our camera. Or the one next to it is show all objects, which doesn't have a hotkey. I can just press it and that will snap to view everything in the workspace. One other thing we can do with our parameters over here, specifically our size, is I can click into here and say times 2, and that will increase that size by 2. So that'll double its size. This is particularly useful when we're working with resolutions and things like that, where we can divide things in half or multiply them by 2 really, really easily by just doing the math in here. Another thing that we can do in the workspace is we can snap objects together. In order to do that, I can go over to my library and grab another object and bring it into my workspace. Now I've got 2 different displays here. The way that we snap things in PIXERA is when I click on an object, we can see a crosshair appear, depending on which quadrant I have actually clicked into. That quadrant or that crosshair is going to become my snap to point. So if I click in the middle, it's that center point, or in the top right, it becomes the top right corner of my object. And if I press shift once, I'm not going to hold it. I just press it one time. That gets me a horizontal shift. And if I press shift again, that gets me a vertical shift. So if, for example, I wanted to snap this corner to this corner, I would grab this object in the top right and then press shift one time so that I could align it with that corner, and then press shift again to vertically align it down here. Now I'll press Control Z a couple of times. Control Z does undo in PIXERA. Control Shift Z will redo. So Control Z. Now, say I want to have this corner be a certain distance, or maybe this bottom right corner be a certain distance away from this top left corner. If I click and hold in the bottom left and press shift to get my vertical alignment here, we can see I get a box here saying what this distance is. And if I click into here, I could say I want this to be 2 meters, and that will automatically snap that to be 2 meters apart.